Chapter 21 is about employment discrimination. Talks about the employment at will doctrine, which is a contract of employment for an indeterminate term, is terminable at will by either the employer or the employee. The traditional American rule governing employer-employee relations. Public policy exception, an exception to the employment at will doctrine that makes it unlawful to dismiss an employee for taking certain actions in the public interest. Implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing exception, an exception to the employment at will doctrine based on the theory that every employment contract, even an unwritten one, contains the implicit understanding that the parties will deal fairly with each other. Civil Rights Act of 1866 was a statute guaranteeing that all persons in the U.S. have the same right to make and enforce contracts and make the full and equal benefit of the law. Civil Rights Act of 1871 was a statute that prohibits discrimination by state and local governments. Equal Pay Act of 1963 was a statute that prohibits wage discrimination based on sex. Disparate treatment occurs when the employer treats one employee less favorably than another because of that employee's color, race, religion, sex, or national origin. Disparate impact occurs when the employer's facially neutral policy or practice has a discriminatory effect on employees who belong to a protected class. Sexual harassment is unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature that explicitly or implicitly make submission a term or condition of employment or creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive environment. Same-sex harassment talked about people of the same sex being harassed, and the fact that that is also just like being sexually harassed. There's no difference just because it's same sex. Hostile environment, working discrimination based on religion, race, or age. Retaliation, an employer cannot retaliate. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act, not allowed based on pregnancy. Talked about age discrimination in Employment Act of 1967, the statute that prohibits employers from refusing to hire, discharging, or discriminating against people in terms or conditions of employment on the basis of age. Executive exemption to the ADA that allows mandatory retirement of executives at age 65. Rehabilitation Act of 1973 prohibits discrimination in employment against otherwise qualified persons who have a handicap. Applies only to the federal government, employers that have contracts with the federal government, and parties who administer programs that receive federal financial assistance. Americans with Disabilities Act of 1991, the statute requiring that employers make reasonable accommodations to the known disabilities of of an otherwise qualified job applicant or employee with a disability unless the necessary accommodation would impose an undue burden on the employer's business. Affirmative action plans are programs adopted by employers to increase the representation of women and minorities in their workforces. Reverse discrimination in favor of members of groups that have been previously discriminated against claim usually is raised by white males, is what the book was saying. Chapter 22 is about environmental law. Talked about nuisance, an unreasonable interference with someone else's use and enjoyment of his or her land. Technology forcing standards are standards of pollution control set primarily on the basis of health considerations with assumption industry will develop technology needed to meet the standards. Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, is the federal agency charged with the responsibility of conducting an integrated coordination attack on all forms of pollution of the environment. Environmental Impact Statement, or the EIS statement, that must be prepared for every major federal activity that would significantly affect the quality of the human environment. Point sources, distinct places from which pollutants are discharged into water, such as paper mills, electric utility plants, sewage treatment facilities, and factories. Effluent limitations, maximum allowable amounts of pollutants that can be discharged from a point source within a given time period. National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or the NAAQS, is a two-tiered set of standards developed for the chief conventional air pollutants, primary standards designed to protect public health, and secondary standards designed to protect public welfare. State Implementation Plan, or the SIP, is a plan required of every state that explains how the state will meet federal air pollution standards. Acid rain is precipitations with a high acidic content, which means a pH level of less than 5 caused by atmospheric pollutants. Manifest program is a program that attempts to see that hazardous wastes are properly transported to disposal facilities licensed by the EPA so that the agency will have an accurate record or manifest of the location and amount of all hazardous waste. Hazardous waste is any waste material that is ignitable, corrosive, reactive, or toxic when ingested or absorbed. A superfund, which is a fund authorized by CERCLA to cover the cost of cleaning up hazardous waste disposal sites whose owners cannot be found or are unwilling or unable to pay for the cleanup. Toxic substance is any chemical or mixture whose manufacture, processing, distribution, use, or disposal presents an unreasonable risk of harm to human health or the environment. Pesticide, any substance designed to prevent, destroy, repel, or mitigate any pest or to be used as a plant regulator or defoliant. We had, I live out in the country, and just the other day I kept hearing a plane outside, and I took my daughter outside so that way we could watch the plane spray the fields. So I know that they were using a form of pesticide. They do that every year to spray the fields, kill the weeds, and then get ready to replant. I live out in the country, like I said, so it's a lot of rural property. So I am familiar with pollutants and the importance of following standards. As a homeowner, we have to abide by the laws. There's the no burning, no open burning during certain hours or certain times of year, I think is how it is. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I do know that they have regulations for that as well. As far as the nuisance, I used to live in town, and I do recall people complaining about different things in a person's yard, like a bunch of broke vehicles, for example, vehicles that don't even run, that can be considered a nuisance. Broken down buildings that need to be torn down, things like that will end up causing rodents to live there, or possibly, stray cats. could even turn into something worse than that. As far as the Chapter 21 on employment discrimination, I know I've had multiple conversations about employment at will, and it really surprised me at the amount of people that don't realize that Ohio is an at-will state, which means when you sign your paperwork for your employer, you're an at-will employee. You can be let go at any given time for any purpose with no questions asked. And it really surprises me the amount of people that don't pay attention to what they're signing, and the fact that they can be let go for no reason at all whatsoever, and they have no repercussions for it. As far as the laws about pregnancy discrimination, I know that I've heard different places don't hire because maybe you come into the job knowing that you're pregnant and you disclose that in the interview, and then they don't hire you because they know that in set amount of time you're going to be requesting time off for that pregnancy. But of course, legally they can't come out and say that was the reason why they weren't hired. I actually experienced something in my own life that I still to this day can't believe it happened. I didn't pursue anything with it legally, or really I didn't do anything about it. But I was up for a management position. My manager of a business was leaving, and she recommended me to take over her position. And when I had my interview with the owner, he asked me in the interview if I was planning on having a family. And I, of course, said, yes, I am planning on having a family. And he said, well, this job is very demanding, and the person that I hire for this position has to be really dedicated to this position. And I think that if you would be starting a family or have a small young family in this position, I think it would be harder for you to hold the position. So I would have to rethink whether or not I would give you this position, because it is very time consuming. That really surprised me that came up in the interview. I was definitely floored by that conversation. I did not get the position. I didn't even have a follow-up conversation about it. I was still with the same employer when he came out and introduced the new manager, which was an older gentleman who all of his children are grown up and out of the house, and it is just him and his wife. And it did make me feel some kind of way about it. But at the same time, I have my beautiful daughter, and I wouldn't change that for anything. I did stay with the company in the capacity that I was already in, and I just continued to exceed at that and never really thought any more about it. But I do have experience with that, so I wanted to share that in the video. Hope you enjoyed my recap.